I'll kick off. Heather and Misha, I've got a feeling that invasive species is one of your main challenges. And I think this is really interesting because it kind of points towards a growing problem. I was wondering if you could kick off this session just telling us about the scale of this problem.
Sure. So in a South African context, regardless of the province that you're in, we're seeing pervasive non-indigenous vegetation. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but from 2015 to about 2018 in South Africa, we were facing day zero with regards to our couple of our major cities running out of water, including Cape Town and Port Elizabeth. And a large part of that challenge with regards to capturing water is due to the number of alien vegetation that essentially is covering much of our landscapes. So yes, it's a massive issue. It's a massive issue because of water and how much it takes. It also is a massive issue because of the fire, as I mentioned in my presentation. And then more than that, it has the capacity to completely take over from a monoculture perspective, which totally reduces the biodiversity of some very fragile landscapes. Our burn rate increases substantially, which means that very little or none of the fynbos, which is a particular type of species that's found only in South Africa, is left. And then where there are forests pockets, those get buffered up against by the alien vegetation, and increasingly will start getting these fissures, and those fissures then turn into fractures, and those fractures then turn those forests into smaller and smaller pockets of forest, and eventually they wipe them out. So yes, it's a massive issue, and one that I would say the South African government does not have a handle on, and is necessitating private public partnerships and NGOs like ourselves to intervene.
Hello. Heather, how do you compare your experience to what Misha's just reported? Hello, Heather, can you hear us? Oh, you're muted.
Yes. Yeah, sorry about that. I lost connectivity.
No worries.
The joys of being in different parts of the world.
That makes it even more interesting. Were you able to hear Misha's contribution to the invasive species discussion?
Yes, I was able to hear some of it.
Great. We just want to hear your perspective.
Yeah, look, we have major issues in Australia, both with invasive plants as well as animals, and that's where most of my team's work is spent. Is actually, we say on a daily basis, our time is spent on fire, ferals and weeds. So fire, managing fire, both to manage the landscape from a cultural perspective, as well as helping with restoration and dealing with weeds, as well as then the day-to-day of managing feral animals, whether that be and introduced animals, whether that be cats, deers, pig, camels, depending on where you are, as well as weeds. So significant problem that I think all of us around the globe need to work on to be able to get the biodiversity outcomes that we need.
Thank you. That sounds really listening. Emma, I'll get back to you on blue carbon, but I just want to touch base very quickly with John first, because in the presentation that we heard about the Kaleka project, one thing that stood out to me was the complexity of the management systems required to successful delivery. And that also percolates into all the other three projects, but particularly yours, John. Would you mind sharing with us a bit of an insight about how do you manage those multiple strands at the same time to ensure successful delivery?
Thank you for the question. So I guess it comes back to the history of the project, and that we've been doing this for about 10 years now. So And it's been a kind of iterative approach of working with the local governments to address the issue of how do you stop deforestation and degradation, which is driven by commodity production. So initially, the government's approach is to look at it through the lens of laws and regulations. As we go through each step, then we start to work with companies, and then we find what their needs are. And then, so each part of the process is, it isn't complex as an overarching approach. It's just that each time we find a new challenge, we have to think of ways to address those. And what we learned is, okay, from the start, maybe working with the government is the first key step. Then you need to work with the companies, to produce the companies, then involve the smallholders, and then start to think about how do you address those issues at the landscape level. So how do you restore those degraded ecosystems? How do you protect the remaining forests that are there? And for each one of those problems, there's a different solution. What we have, though, at the district level are these multi-stakeholder working groups, which help to look at these issues and then think of the solution. So it's managed through a kind of centralized process. So I guess those are the two elements. Is one, we have an overarching framework for managing the complexity. And two, it's kind of done in an iterative way. So we don't do it all at once, but we do it step by step.
Okay, thank you very much. That dovetails really nicely into a question I'd like each of you to just contribute, which is, how do you engage with the local communities? How do you recruit supporters to deliver your project? Because we were just discussing about management systems, but Misha, you've got a very complex network of supporters for the nurseries, for the project delivery, Heather as well. I'd love to hear from you, Emma. So if you'd like to start, how do you engage with local communities and how do you continue to feed the love so that you've got engagement?
Would you like me to start?
Yes, please.
There's a couple of different strategies that I guess we've deployed so far. One has been building relationships with well-respected NGOs that are already working on the ground in certain coastal catchments. And so they already have, in some instances, built relationships of trust with Indigenous peoples landholders, with the local government agencies. And then the second piece to that is developing our own relationships. So the five of us have been working in the space, albeit in a different capacity, for a considerable amount of time. So me, as a public interest lawyer, a cornerstone of that work has been developing relationships with communities, working at a very grassroots level to then go and do quite complex legal work and often litigation. And so I've been able to draw on some of those networks for the purposes of project development opportunities for Restore Blue. And similarly, my business partners, they've restored 6 large sites in New South Wales, which is located in southeastern Australia. And they've done that on a non-commercial basis, but as a consequence of that work, they've actually built fairly extensive networks locally with a lot of the local landholders.
Thank you. Misha?
Thank you. So one of the first things that we look to do is setting up a community committee, which essentially allows for us to work across a cross-section of stakeholders. There's always a local NGO or a number of local NGOs that we're working with. And what we find is that we're able to get a lot more in-depth understanding of the community dynamics, of the leadership, what's happening from a municipal point of view or government point of view, but then also going as grassroots as possible, whether there is a women's group or a leadership group within a community, bringing all of these stakeholders together. And some of the projects, we also facilitate something called an asset-based community development approach. which is ultimately allows for us to really understand the perspective the community has around what assets they have available to them. And that point of departure then gives us an idea of where do we need to take this? How are we going to develop alternative livelihoods that puts less strain on forests, that realizes different values, which is outside of the context of timber, whether that's a livelihoods thing or an energy mix thing. But through the questioning, through the setting up of the relationships, through having eyes on a broad number of stakeholders, both community, NGO, and government, we start to really feel and understand the realities of what's on the ground. And then through a community point of view, really get to the depths of what their perspective is of livelihoods and of the value that they're trying to receive in order to thrive or survive in that context.
Okay, sounds magical and challenge at the same time. Heather, what's your experience?
So I think a key experience for us is because we own land and actually living in communities is actually being a good neighbour and being part of that community. So a couple of the key things is really strongly engaging with First Nations people and giving them access back to land, because particularly along the eastern and southwest part of Western Australia, but the east coast of Australia too, First Nations people have been dispossessed from that land. So this is a real opportunity to engage them back on that land and work together. Also working obviously with other local NGOs and national NGOs, governments, being, as I said, being part of the local community. And that often means being part of the community around fire. So I'm being part of those local fire teams, so when there is a wildfire, we're in there with our neighbours fighting it together. And then for us too, it's our sort of, army, I call them, of supporters and volunteers and spreading that word. I think the other thing too for us, because we're predominantly in productive sheep or beef areas, is showing that you can have, we're a conservation reserve, but we actually help those neighbours understand what they've got there from a biodiversity perspective. And you see their eyes light up and go, oh, I've got this or I've got that. And they get involved with trying to protect those species as well.
Brilliant.
So it's about being a good neighbour, effectively.
That's great. And John, what's your experience like in Indonesia?
Maybe more specifically on the restoration topic is, I guess when we've worked with communities on the topic of restoration in the context of Kalimantan, is a lot of the lands are vacant. They've been degraded over decades of fires, which were initially kind of triggered by concessions which were out of the control of the local communities. So when we engage with them, it's kind of giving them options for what they can do with these lands that they don't have or don't know what to do with them now. So they've been vacant, they're fire prone, they create problems for village. So we work through a participatory process where we say, as a project, we can support you into restoring these lands in a way which kind of balances the ecological needs of restoration, but also provides some economic benefit. And also working with them to identify, okay, what type of species would you like to plant? What type of agroforestry systems do you think would be most beneficial? We understand that it's a bit of a risk at first, so we work with the village to say, okay, which lands do you think are priorities for restoration? How would you like to do it? Who in the village would like to be involved? So we keep working with the villagers in that type of participatory process until there is a model of restoration which they feel is beneficial. So we don't rush the process. It's not just trying to force tree planting, but trying to come up with a model which they like, which solves the ecological problem, but also provides them with the economic benefits that they need.
Thank you. I noticed that throughout your presentations, one of the key challenges is how to bring scalability to your projects. And I'd like to hear, we're at an investors conference here, so very quickly, assuming you've been granted the money, you've implemented, you've had success, what is the next step? Where do you go from there? What do you bring in terms of all this conversation we've had about how do you manage, how do you deliver, how do you monitor, how do you scale it further? What are the challenges withholding you? Emma, if you would like to start.
In Australia, one of the challenges is around land aggregation. So in inland Australia, the properties are extremely large, and so a restoration project typically will correspond to one landholding, and so you'd enter into an agreement with an individual landholder, which reduces complexity from a legal perspective. On the coast, like in many countries, that's where the majority of people live, and so there are more landholdings, and they may be smaller. And there may be more than one covering what we call a hydrological unit in a catchment that requires restoration work. And so there's more work that needs to be done. It's absolutely achievable. And the reason I think it's achievable is because now there's finally an economic incentive for those landholders to convert their low productivity agricultural land to mangroves or salt marsh, so that there is the incentive. But notwithstanding that, it is more work because you need to, in some instances, aggregate more than 2 or 3 properties. I mean, our strategy is really to go for the lowest hanging fruit. There are bigger properties, and we've already started to have some conversations with some partners who are interested in us working with them to develop those larger properties. So that's sort of the first step. And then moving beyond that, once you've got the proof of concept, you can then go to those catchments where you might have more landholders and you need to aggregate. But once they've seen proof of concept, there is that economic incentive because blue carbon credits now exist. I think we've got a good chance of hitting that target. So that's in Australia, but as I mentioned in the presentation, the goal is really to work internationally, and it's actually been really pleasing since we launched, which was only about 6 months ago. We have been contacted by people around the world who are interested in working with us, and it's just a process, I think, of building those relationships from the ground up. You can't do it quickly. It has to be done respectfully, slowly, building those relationships out. And then extending the work to some of those overseas locations.
Thank you. It's interesting to imagine that, whilst you're targeting the blue carbon and, the river, the estuaries, those areas, mangroves, Heather is working in the same country with similar challenges, looking at the inland part. It looks like we've got the potential for a partnership here. So, Heather, would you like to comment and add your perspective to Emma's contribution, please?
Thanks for that. And I was just nodding my head as Emma was talking because some of our properties are 200,000 hectares each, so they're large. I think that the challenges for us and the project we put forward was on our Yorker Reserve, and that's really proving up how we bring all the data sets together. Part of the challenge is we're data rich, insight poor, and we need those insights to be able to effectively manage the land and the challenges of climate change. So I think then the challenge of taking that at scale from Yorker is, we will be able to, I suppose what we call, crack the code, so to speak, for, how to do some of the technology things really easily, and that'll be scalable across all landscapes, particularly, say, bird sounds and how you put that data in. But the vegetation stuff is more complex. How do you go from, forest area, that's sort of, that looks like the image that's behind John, to areas of desert? And the algorithms and how you do that. So I think that's where the challenge is, but it's all solvable. It just needs great minds looking at the data and going, actually, how do we actually put together satellite, drone, and the information on the ground to pull all of that together? So it's very doable. It just needs people who look at landscapes in a different way than, say, I might do, and how they then work the algorithms. But I've seen some amazing tech teams who have been able to, do the artificial intelligence to be able to tell the difference between a fox, a dingo, a kangaroo, an emu, to be able to then cope with large data sets, so that you're not having people screening data, which is the way we used to do it. So everything's possible.
That's really interesting. Misha, we've been discussing the Australian perspective on large tracts of land. When you bring that to your scale of project with multiple connections, a bigger social footprint, how do you extrapolate what Emma and Heather have been telling us about?
Thank you for that question. So in a South African context, we have no problem working with the South African government. It's largely underfunded and under-resourced, and so we've very much got a thumbs up from their side. I think in terms of working with community groups and local grassroots organizations, it's going to be very much a slow and steady approach, just to echo, I think, what Emma was saying. We have to build the relationships. You've got to start at the beginning. There's no rushing that part of the process because it's key to your success. I think building on that, one needs to research the full scope of what needs to get underway. And we've got that happening on a few of our project sites now. Much of the landscape will be similar over a certain region, but the cultures can shift, and there are a few other variables that could come into place. So building those relationships and ensuring there's a sufficient amount of incentive for community and government to participate is really critical. And then in terms of the M&E, if you can get the M&E right, if you've got the right mix of technology and ground truths, you can ensure that you're bringing in the right adaptive management during the implementation, and that you're always learning through the process. From a scale perspective, we have no shortage of projects that are approaching us saying, we really need to restore our forests. We're a forest community or a rural community, and we really need to do something about what's happening on the ground here. It's more a case of when we have the funding, we can start the implementation, and ensuring that it's not a case of saying, and this happens to us quite often, is someone will come to us and say, we want to plant 100,000 trees in 6 months' time. So, well, that's, from our perspective, completely unsustainable, because we need to do the groundwork. We need to ensure that we've set up the relationships in the right way, and we need to grow whatever vegetation to a meaningful size in order to do it in a holistic way.
Makes sense. Thank you. John, we're going to stick to that technology angle that has been growing in our conversation. Would you mind sharing how you see the adoption of these MRV technologies for the reporting, for the monitoring, for the delivery of your multiple sites?
So I guess our project hasn't evolved, wasn't set up initially as a kind of restoration or reforestation project. We kind of evolved that way in that what we're trying to do is look at the social and ecological costs of oil palm production, but also looking at other commodities and how do you incorporate that into measuring the cost of production of these commodities. So when we've approached because we've been doing it in addition to the work with these commodities, we've looked at trying to find simple solutions, which is part of the reason of the collaboration with Explorer.land, is that we haven't tried to go towards any of those strict kind of standards, but rather look at how do we use public platforms for showing the success of our work. How can we use it we're doing the monitoring just to look at the success of the work, but also trying to tell the stories of how effective it is. So it's using that mix of platforms like Explorer.land, but also doing field surveys and then also interviews, but just trying to communicate them. In part, we do that because just the way that we've approached the project is that we've not had to have too rigorous a model of MRV that's defined by those standards, but really we're just trying to engage with our partners in a meaningful way to demonstrate progress both ecologically and socially and transparently.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got just a couple of minutes left. And of course, one of the key questions that we've been touching on is engaging local communities. And you're here asking for investment. One of the key questions that people would like to know is, how do you decide, how do you transfer those funds to the local communities? How do you share the benefits, both financial and technical, with them? In just a couple of seconds, let's go back to you, John. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about what is the process you have about sharing the benefits with the local communities?
So we've moved, because we're looking at, so the two main districts we work with are kind of like in terms of scale, like the size of Belgium, I guess. So what we do is we've moved from a project type phase into a more programmatic phase, in that the villages have a process now where they can apply for the funds through a project when they commit to meeting social and human rights components, in that they're going to protect the forests that are there, but once they receive these incentives, they'll implement sustainable activities there, as well as protecting human rights within those villages. So we use a transfer mechanism that's through a government-led process, but it's distributed to these villages through a transparent mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that is the way we see achieving scale, is to get greater alignment with these governmental processes.
That's great. Thank you. Heather, would you like to share your view on that?
Yeah, look, and it's challenging. Just picking up a point from a number of the others, it's about building the relationships. And so we build relationships with First Nations people, with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders of the land we work on. But there's over 200 nations in Australia. So each group will have their different priorities. So it's about spending that time and energy and doing it slowly and at the time frame that works with them, to then work out, how they want to have, whether it be knowledge transfer, access to land. It's every relationship's different, and it's very personalised to that particular group, and it's in their time frame.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, we have a series of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement managers who focus on building those relationships. So it's about doing that and then determining what is the right transfer for that group. What's the right engagement?
Mm-hmm. Misha, what's your perspective?
Thank you. So we look at it from somewhat of a collaborative budgeting process. We've mapped out what the variables could be, and then try and approach it in a way that's transparent for the partners that are supporting the implementation process. There is an emphasis also on leveling the gender gaps. So we, within the concept node phasing, are trying to work out wherever possible that we're ensuring that money is going into the hands of women that are working on the ground. And then lastly, we look at it from a tranching point of view. So throughout the contracted relationship, we have certain metrics that we're trying to meet, be it clearing of alien, growing of trees, planting of trees, monitoring of trees. And so that there is a general motivation to ensure that the system stays alive, so that the plants that are planted stay in place and aren't cleared for agriculture or whatever the case may be, and that the relationship can develop and grow and flourish. And so by hopefully having all this transparency and clarity, the motivation is there on a community level to really participate in an active way.
It's really interesting, isn't it? There's this theme of nurturing nature, nurturing relationships with the people relative to that. Emma, closing remarks in just a few seconds, please.
So just briefly, just to reiterate what Heather said, a lot of the east coast of Australia has basically resulted, colonisation has resulted in Aboriginal people being dispossessed of their land. So most land is owned by non-Indigenous people. And so in those instances where we're working with non-Indigenous landholders, it's really about bringing in local traditional owners, and as Heather said, finding out how they'd like to be engaged in the project and how their cultural knowledge as well can input into the actual restoration side of things. Beyond that, and from a financial perspective, the way that the profits are split are very heavily weighted in favour of the landholder. And then just finally, in other parts of Australia, Aboriginal land tenure in its various forms is far more common, and so we anticipate that we will be working with traditional owners who actually do own their land, and so it will be very much about restoring the site consistently with their values and their priorities. And as I mentioned, the profit sharing arrangement for our business is very much in favour of the proponent, of the landholder.
That's great. That's great. I'd like to thank our panel deeply. Thank you very much for the insights, sharing the knowledge, sharing the passion, and we wish you all the very best. Thanks again. Thank you.